My mother took a kitchen knife and chopped up my father and grandmother. I was the only witness. My mother has already confessed to the crime, but the police still won't let go of me. Over and over again they ask me, "What did you see? What did you hear? What did you do?" 1. I tremble with fear, and I hate the policeman interrogating me. I grit my teeth and try to control my emotions. I couldn't understand why they had to hear it from me. Why did they need to hear it from me? Where did a woman get the strength to chop up a strong man? And two men at the same time? The man looked like he had no feelings, and every word he said made the air around him seem to turn cold. Your mother confessed so readily? She described the incident so seamlessly, but she missed one detail. Water meters not only calculate water bills, they also record the time of water use, accurate to the second. The sound of water rushing through the pipes immediately came to mind, splashing, splashing. This contrasted sharply with the sound of blood dripping. Zhang, your mother is taking the blame for you, isn't she? This was clearly a question, but the man sounded like he was making a statement. In your mother's confession, she said that the water meter in your house was moving at the moment she swung the knife at the person, and she said that you were not there at the time, so why did the water meter move? I had been silent for too long. I hadn't spoken since the beginning of the incident. Everyone thought I was too shocked to speak, but in fact, my mother specifically told me not to speak. Because if you say too much, there will always be loopholes. But at this moment, I couldn't hold back any longer. I looked up at the policeman and asked calmly, "If I explain this, will that prove that my mother killed the people?" 2. The police had been waiting for me to speak for a long time, and they let out a sigh of relief when they heard me speak. But when they heard this, their expressions instantly became even more serious. I told them, my parents had a very bad relationship. As far as I can remember, they often fought and argued, and when things got really bad, they would shout and scream. Maybe this time they really went too far. My mother was so angry that she went to the kitchen and grabbed a kitchen knife and chopped up my father. My grandmother must have tried to save her son, but my mother was so mad that she chopped her up too. I'm sure that's what my mother told the police. The interrogator and the person taking the statement looked at each other and asked, puzzled, could it be? Didn't you see what happened? I shook my head and said, I'm about to go to university. I did well in the exams, but it's too far away from home, and my father doesn't want to pay for it, so I'm working as a tutor to earn tuition fees. The student's family went out for a walk that day, but they didn't tell me, so I went there and found it was empty. That's why I came back early. Who knew that as soon as I opened the door, my mother was hacking them to death? My father was covered in blood and lying on the ground, no longer able to fight back. My grandmother had also been slashed several times, but she still tried to jump over to shield my father from the knives. My mother was so angry that she kicked her away, and the blood from her body splattered all over my face. As I spoke, I couldn't help but sigh repeatedly. I don't know what emotion I was feeling as I said, my grandmother was very good to me. When I was young, my family was very poor, but she still let me live like a little emperor. For many years, she toiled and suffered to take care of and raise me. My mother finally stopped her rampage. She gasped for breath and cried out to me, "It was them, they're not human, don't blame me, don't blame me, I was forced to do it." My mother pointed at the door and shouted at me, "Go, just go, pretend you didn't see anything." I hesitated for a second, but didn't say anything. My grandmother tried her best to grab my pant leg, but I avoided it. I went inside as if nothing had happened, into the bathroom, turned on the tap, and rinsed the blood from my face while listening to the sound of the meat being chopped outside. At first, the sound of the water was so loud that it drowned out their screams, but gradually I could hear nothing more. I waited until there was no more noise outside before I turned off the tap and came out. Dad was dead. Grandma was dead. Mom had thrown the cleaver down and was sitting on the floor, too weak to move. There was so much blood. I looked around and saw blood everywhere. At that moment, I heard footsteps downstairs. My mother immediately perked up and ordered me, call the police quickly. If someone else calls the police first, it will be your fault." Then I called the police. I looked up at them, and it was obvious that they didn't believe me. "You saw your mother stab your father and grandmother, but instead of stopping her, you calmly went to the bathroom to wash the blood off your face?" I nodded in confirmation and asked, "What crime have I committed? Aiding and abetting?" I asked curiously, suppose I said that I was so shocked that I didn't know what to do, and that I went to the bathroom to wash my face because I was in a daze. Will the police not pursue my crime of inaction? I sighed helplessly. In fact, I was in a difficult situation. My father and grandmother were killed, and my mother was the murderer. My words, or lack thereof, were like someone sawing at my flesh with a saw. I asked in bewilderment, "Why do you have to listen to me? I'm just a kid who has just finished taking the college entrance exam. Aren't you worried about what psychological problems I might develop after witnessing such a thing? Just because I'm an adult, 18 years old, doesn't mean I don't need protection? Is there such a big difference between the day before and the day after turning 18? I even felt a little hatred. Hate them all. If I had known this was going to happen, why didn't it happen sooner? At least, as a minor, I could have gotten away with it and not had to endure such endless questioning by the police. 3. Maybe I was being too calm. The police officer interrogating me looked at me with increasingly sharp eyes. Do I look like I've been frightened? I retorted. Do I have to be crazy to be considered to have been excessively shocked? Someone died, someone confessed to the murder, can't the police close the case quickly? Those who need to handle the funeral should do so, and those who need to be tried should go to court. I don't have much time left, I need to report to university in half a month. Hearing me say this, the police officer was furious. Even though he was deliberately controlling his emotions, he still slammed his hand on the table in dissatisfaction, making a dull sound. Do you know who the dead person is? Do you know who the murderer is? They are both your loved ones. How can you say such cold-hearted things? I asked indifferently, so what do you want me to say? That my father was a criminal and deserved to die, or that my mother is a murderer and you should have shot her long ago? I put on a blank face. I clearly didn't want to say anything, and I shouldn't have said anything, but you insisted that I do so. And when I did, you didn't believe me. You think I'm cold-hearted? And you're not? If I were to cry my heart out at this moment, what would you think of me? Most likely, you would think that I'm still a child crying like this even though I'm already an adult. There must be some kind of story behind it, right? I mocked them. It seemed like they couldn't find anything to argue with, so they had to change the subject and ask, is it true that you heard that your father has a tendency to abuse and often beats your mother? 4. It's such a true thing, but they had to come to me to confirm it again, which is really interesting. It's true. My mom often had new injuries on top of old ones. I said, these neighbors all know about it. If you don't believe me, roll up her sleeves and see for yourself. The bruises from the last beating should still be there. The police officers were surprised and asked, you knew about this? Of course I knew. I was also surprised. Why did they think I didn't know? If I didn't know, who would have helped her clean the wound? Who would have helped her apply medicine? Who would have been able to take her to the hospital in time when she was dying? Hearing this, the policemen felt really uncomfortable, and they wanted to say something, but it seemed like they couldn't. Finally, they asked slightly accusingly, you're so tall, when your father was beating her, didn't you try to stop him? Stop him? How could I stop him? I wasn't born this tall. When I was little, if I tried to intervene, my father would just kick me away. My mother could still resist, escape and hide. When I went over to her, she was like a hen with her wings spread, protecting me with her life. Then she would stand still and immobile, letting my father punch and kick her. When I grew up a little and understood a little more, every time my father hit her, she would close the door herself so I wouldn't see. My grandmother also covered my eyes and told me, your mother has made a mistake, and your father is teaching her a lesson. If you make a mistake, you deserve to be beaten. Didn't your school teacher teach you that? When I finally had my own sense of right and wrong and was taller than my mother, and I could also put my arms around my father like her, I yelled at him, don't hit my mother, if you hit my mother again, I'll kill you. That worked. After that, I didn't see my father hit my mother anymore. All I could see were the bruises on her body and her tears that wouldn't stop falling. I chased him with the stick to where he was playing cards, and without saying a word, I hit him with the stick. I wasn't afraid of him hurting at all. Several adults came to drag me away, but I wouldn't let go, and I beat him until his head was bleeding. I thought he would definitely not dare to do it again. But guess what happened? My mother knelt at the door of the room and begged him for 3 days and 3 nights before he threw the household registration book at me as if it were a charity. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to go to high school. 5. I called the police. But what could the police do when they arrived? He was a real tough guy, and he wasn't afraid of the police. He shouted at the top of his voice, "I hit my wife, and you're going to let me? I climb into her bed, and you're going to let me?" The police didn't want to argue with this scoundrel, and asked my mother, "Are you going to get a medical examination?" My mother didn't understand. The policeman said, as long as the injury report is assessed as a minor injury, he can be sent to prison. My grandmother waved her hands in fear and said, "What do you mean prison? I've never seen anyone go to prison for beating their wife. If he goes to prison, who will support me as his old mother?" He pointed at the police officer who responded to the call and asked, "Do you care about me? Or do you care about me? If you arrest my son, I'll go to your house and eat, drink, shit and sleep there. What kind of woman lets her man go to jail after just a few beatings?" My grandmother pointed at my mother and cursed, "You really are a disaster and a scourge. What good will it do you to send your man to jail? Will it make it easier for you to cheat on him?" More and more people gathered to watch the scene, but none of them were helpful. In the end, the police would say, "You won't go to the hospital to get your injuries checked, right? Well, we can't do anything about that. You two should sort out your own family matters yourselves, and stop wasting police time." And then? They got up, and my father beat my mother up again. This time they learned their lesson. My father didn't hit my mother in the face. And my mother kept quiet. When he saw the hatred in my eyes, my father would smile at me, a strange smile. He dragged my mother in front of me and ordered her, "Look into your son's eyes. This is the good son you gave birth to, the good son you raised. He dared to look at me like that today, and someday, he'll dare to look at you like that." He would pat my face and say, "Son, you're still young and don't understand. Women are all bitches. You have to beat them, or they won't listen." He would also say smugly, "Spanking is affection, and scolding is love." He told my mother to reason with me. My mother told me earnestly, "Xiao Zhang, your father just has a bad temper. Just go along with him a bit. Study hard and don't worry about these things." Later, I went to live in a boarding school. Even though she hid everything from me, I knew she had been beaten again. I told my mother, "Get a divorce. I'll go with you." My mother shook her head and said, "Just bear with it. Study hard, and when you get into university, it'll be fine." 6. Those painful memories are like nails in my head. I don't want to think about them, but when I do, it really hurts. I whispered, "Get used to it, I got used to it a long time ago." I sighed again and again. I had no hope, so I could only bury my head in my books. I had to get into college, and only then could I take my mother and flee far away from the scum. I unconsciously raised my hand and wiped my face, and my hand was damp. Only then did I realize that I had shed tears. So, I was not at all surprised when my mother hacked my father to death. I believe that she must have mentally hacked him countless times before the moment came when she held the knife, and she did not hesitate. You ask me why I am so indifferent? Because if I wasn't indifferent, as soon as my father found the opportunity to fight back, it would be my mother who would lose her life. The policeman pondered for a while and asked, "Your mother has endured for so long, but why, when you were about to go to university, did she suddenly lose her temper? Assuming that she had been waiting for you to get into university before getting a divorce, then she should have mentioned the divorce to your father the moment you got into university. She should have received the university admission notice long ago. She didn't mention divorce, but instead killed your father and grandmother at this time. The motive of domestic violence alone seems unjustifiable. After all, it wasn't the first time your father had committed domestic violence." Domestic violence? Domestic violence alone? Not the first time? Look at that, what a cold-hearted person. He summed up the misfortune of someone else's life with the mere words, domestic violence. How was I supposed to know? My mother didn't have time to tell me. Didn't she tell you in the interrogation room? Faced with my barrage of questions, the policeman hesitated for a moment before saying, "Your mother said that during lunch, your father found fault with the food, saying that it was too salty, and tried to hit her. So she was so angry that she went to the kitchen and got a knife." I continued, "You don't believe me?" The policeman was at a loss for words again. They were so persistent, so there must be some doubt about the case. But I couldn't think of what the specific doubts were. "Take a break." The interrogating policeman stood up and said. I asked, "Can't I go? Where are the bodies of my father and grandmother? Don't I need to prepare for the funeral?" "Their bodies are still with the forensic doctor. It depends on the direction the case takes as to when they can be claimed. I asked again, what about my mother? She is still being interrogated. What about me? Wait, we still have some questions for you. In short, they wouldn't let me go. 7. After about 2 hours, they continued to interrogate me, saying, we just met with some of your family's neighbors, and they can all testify that your father often abused your mother, but they also said that it was because your mother cheated on him that he did this. Hearing this, my fists couldn't help but clench. I looked at them and didn't say a word. They urged, is it true? I asked, what is true? That your mother cheated on you? Who was the other man? Was there no one else at home when you came home? I asked coldly, what are you suspecting? That my mother and her lover conspired to kill my father and my grandmother? The policeman didn't seem to like my rhetorical question very much, and grunted, why do you like to get into such difficult situations? It's not impossible. Your father was 180 centimeters tall, and your mother was 160 centimeters tall. Would it be reasonable for her to just stab your father in the neck? Very reasonable. I replied indifferently. With that height difference, she could just raise her hand and stab your father in the neck, right? But the place was all hacked up. Did your father stand there stupidly while she hacked at him, having been struck by a point? Well, I'm afraid no one can tell for sure, because my mother was so angry. After my father fell, she hacked at him with many more knives. If she had been given more strength and time, it would not have been impossible for her to chop him into a pulp. Weren't you worried that your mother's lover killed them and then your mother took the blame for her lover? I say categorically, my mother did not cheat on me and she did not have a lover. Chen Daolong is the one who wronged her. In the old days, our family lived in the countryside, and the houses were far apart. No one could have heard the screams when someone was about to be beaten to death. But then, our family bought a house in the county town. The neighbors must have had a problem with the constant fighting. But my father would ask, shouldn't I beat the bitch for cuckolding me? Damn it, shouldn't I beat her for flirting with other men all the time? If a male neighbor tried to intervene and give him a beating, he would ask, damn it, you're the adulterer, aren't you? Without waiting for the other person to respond, he would threaten him with a knife, I'll chop you up. Over time, everyone knew that my mother was cheating on him. The women shunned her, gossiping about her behind her back and spurning her. The men also stayed away from her, for fear of getting tangled up with her in some way and getting into trouble. I said, if you don't believe me, you can go to our old home in the countryside and investigate. 8. The police are still capable of getting things done. They didn't need me to urge them to go for such a trivial matter. While they were questioning me, the investigator returned and placed the relevant information in front of their desk. The man looked through it and asked in surprise, your father has never had a proper job. Where did you get the money to buy the house in your county town? After your family moved to the county town, it seems that your parents did not look for work. Where did your family's expenses come from? I tried to remain calm. Didn't your colleagues investigate this thoroughly? Would you believe what I said? If you don't believe it, why are you asking me? Xinjiang, the policeman said sternly, we are asking you, not the other way around. Please cooperate. I thought for a while and said, I don't know. When I was young, I remember my parents working as migrant workers. Later, because my grandmother was not well, they had to come back to take care of her. After that, my mother went out to work as a migrant worker one after the other, while my father stayed at home. Later, when I grew up, my father probably made a living playing mahjong. Most of the money he earned was from the mahjong table. The policeman snorted and said, making a living playing mahjong? That's gambling. Probably. After a short pause, the policeman slowed down his tone and said, do you know what kind of work your mother did outside the home? I shook my head and said, I don't know. Are you sure? I said calmly, I'm sure I don't know. The policeman held up a statement and said, this is a statement from your old neighbors in the countryside. They said that when you were 7 years old, your mother brought a man back from afar and wanted to divorce your father. Do you remember this? I still shook my head and said, no. The policeman shouted, you're lying. Did your father ever hit you? I still shook my head and said, no. When I was little, my grandmother protected me, and when I grew up, he couldn't hit me either. You're lying again. The policeman's voice got louder, and he pointed at me and ordered, take off your shirt. In fact, he didn't mean for me to take it off myself. As soon as he finished speaking, someone came over and pulled my shirt off. "Oh my God," one of the policemen exclaimed. The policeman hurried over to take a look and was also shocked. He asked me, "How did you get these marks on your back?" I said indifferently, "I fell." How could I have fallen over when these obvious whip marks have not faded over the past 10 years or so? "He hit you too?" After all this time talking, I felt the policeman feel a glimmer of sympathy for me for the first time. That summer, Chandelong tied me to the stairs and kept whipping my back with a cattle prod. My grandmother cried out, "Delong, you're going to beat my precious grandson to death. If I don't beat him, his whore of a mother won't come back." He grabbed me by the hair and ordered, "Talk to your mother and tell her to come back." I stubbornly refused to speak, but from the other end of the line came the woman's heart-wrenching wails, Xiao Zhang, what's wrong with you?" "Chen Dalong, what are you doing?" Chen Dalong roared, "I'll give you 3 days. If you don't come back, I'll beat him to death. And as for my money, if there's even 1 cent less than I gave you, I'll skin him alive." My mother argued, "That's not your money, it's my hard-earned money, every last cent of it." Chen Dalong stopped talking and started whipping me again. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer and let out a wail of pain. My mother relented and said, "Stop it, I'll be back, I'll be right back." I hated myself. Why couldn't I hold back? If I hadn't made a sound, would my mother have escaped? I raised my hand to wipe away the tears and said indifferently, "Men who commit domestic violence, beating their wives and children, is very common." They put my clothes down and returned to the matter at hand, saying, "So, it's normal for you to want to kill him for treating you and your mother like this, isn't it?" I avoided the topic and asked with a sneer, "You're not going to ask me who my mother's lover is, are you?" 9. My mother didn't have a lover. That was her salvation. I had only met that man once. He was just an ordinary man from a different place. My family never told me about these things, but the older people in the village would always tell old stories to pass the time. Later. In fact, that man did nothing wrong. Continued. Because he thought my parents had already divorced. Inside. Why? Because Chen Dalong had sold his wife. They worked together as migrant workers, and a small boss who ran a sandyard fell in love with my mother. My father was determined to make my mother a mistress to the boss. Unexpectedly, the boss fell in love for real and promised to give my father a sum of money if he was willing to divorce my mother. This sum of money was enough to bring his seriously ill mother back from the dead and also to live a life of luxury for a while. So, he and my mother had a fake divorce. My mother sold her body to the boss for money, and my father promised to use the money to raise me well. His thinking was that the small business owner would not truly love a country girl, and when he got tired of her, my mother could come back. But he didn't know that there is such a thing as love in the world. The small business owner overcame all the difficulties and wanted to marry my mother. My mother wanted to get the divorce back, so she gave all the money the small business owner had given her to my father, hoping that he would divorce her and give up custody of me. My father was completely panicked. However, he had a trump card. For one thing, legally they were still a real couple. For another, there was me, their son. And for a third, he could afford to be stupid. He went to my grandparents' house with a knife and scared the hell out of my 2 little cousins, threatening to kill the little brats if they dared agree to my mother's divorce and leave the Lee family with no descendants. From then on, my paternal grandparents and uncles completely cut off contact with my mother and forbade her from visiting. Later, the young boss came looking for my mother when he saw that she still hadn't returned. He really loved my mother and didn't mind her cheating, or even the fact that she had a son. He helped her find a lawyer to fight the case. However, he didn't know that some people are worse than pigs and dogs, and even their own sons are just a bargaining chip to achieve their goals. Chen Dalong threatened my mother with my life. At that time, mobile phones did not have a video function, so he would beat me up every other day, making me let out miserable screams. My mother could have escaped and never had to live this kind of hellish life again. It was me. It was all because of me that she continued to come back and put up with this kind of man. The young boss was loyal and caring. Worried that my mother would suffer if she returned, he gave my father a large sum of money, asking nothing in return except that my father treat my mother well. As a result, our family had a house in the county town. To the people in the village, this was equivalent to a carp leaping over the dragon gate. But my mother's life became even more difficult. She could not go out to work and had to stay at home to take care of the children and the elderly. Without money, she was even more dependent on Chen Dalong. He could not remember the 2 biggest sums of money in his life, and both were exchanged by my mother. He only remembered that my mother had followed another man during the period of their fake divorce. When he was happy, he thought that she was jinxed and beat her up. When he was unhappy, he cursed her for cheating and beat her up again. If she showed the slightest sign of resistance, he would beat me up. My mother could only submit to his abuse in order to spare us some suffering. She took the beatings as a matter of course. She didn't fight back or cry out. She just wished the beatings would end quickly. She naively thought that if she was obedient, things would be easier for her and me. She hoped and waited for me to grow up. Unfortunately, it was just a little too late. I sneered and asked, shouldn't Chen Dalong die? Shouldn't my mother have killed him? Wasn't my mother's action considered self-defense? Even if it wasn't considered self-defense, it was at most excessive defense, right? My mother let me report the crime, and she didn't run away after the incident. This is considered self-surrender, isn't it? You people are so persistent. Do you really want to give her the death penalty? I said these words almost with gritted teeth. The policeman asked in a deep voice, if that's all, of course it's considered self-defense, and even if it's excessive self-defense, it won't be severely punished. But what about your grandmother? Your grandmother was so old, and in your mother's hands, she was holding a knife, so she wasn't a threat. Why did she have to chop your grandmother? Your grandmother's head was. The policeman couldn't bear to say it. Yes. My grandmother's head was chopped down to the last skin. But there is good news, the police believe that my mother killed her. 10. I told the police that my mother actually resented my grandmother too. When my mother first became the daughter-in-law of the Chen family, she was given a list of rules to follow. In autumn and winter, my grandmother liked to soak the dirty laundry in cold water overnight, and then have my mother wash it the next morning. The water was already cold, and after a night, the surface was frozen. When she stuck her hand in, her fingers turned red immediately. The day after my mother gave birth, she was asked to get out of bed and cook. My grandmother said, women can't be delicate. Which woman doesn't give birth? When I was young, the elderly people in the village often said that my grandmother was very capable and had her daughter-in-law completely under control. My grandmother was very clever. As soon as I was born, she knew that I was a bargaining chip, a hostage, a chain that would keep my mother working like a slave. Every time I called out for my mother, she would add a bad word to it. Every time I called out for my grandmother, she would happily add a good word. Whenever I was plump and healthy, she would ask, is Grandma taking good care of you? Whenever I had a headache or a stomachache, she would scold my mother, how are you bringing up your child? When I grew up, my grandmother seemed to be a bit more reasonable. She would often persuade my mother after she had been beaten, which woman hasn't gone through this? Just endure it, and when your son grows up and you become a mother-in-law, everything will be fine. Your life is much better than mine. When I was in confinement, I said I wanted to eat eggs, but your father, Dad Long, just smashed raw eggs against the wall and told me to lick them. I, the mother-in-law, still worked hard to raise your child. My mother-in-law made me carry the baby and plant rice in the fields. Men are trees, women are vines. You have to live off your tree. If your tree dies or is damaged, will you be okay? Look at me. Dalong's father is dead, and I have been a widow for him. Everyone praises me when they see me. Unlike you, you can still live after following another man. Your family no longer wants anything to do with you, but we still want you in our family. Your husband is a laughingstock, a living fool, so what if he beats you a little? My grandmother often says to me, your mother is lucky to have ended up in an enlightened family like ours, otherwise she would have been drowned in a pig cage long ago. You are a descendant of the Chen family, and the future of the Chen family depends on you. I advise you to persuade your mother not to stir up trouble. She should think about her own son. She abandoned you at a young age and ran away with another man. Now that you've grown up and are sensible, she's causing trouble every day. Your father could have beaten her to death. Your father is not an unreasonable person, so why would he beat her for no reason? Your father has had a hard life, and your mother is just being ungrateful. You must be a good son and filial to your father in the future. I told the police, my mother must also have particularly resented my grandmother in her heart, so since she was going to block the knife, she might as well be chopped up. At this point, I couldn't help but smile and ask, anyway, there is the circumstance of self-surrender, so they can't sentence her to death, and as the only family member, I will definitely sign a letter of understanding. The police were shocked. They couldn't understand how I could say such things. Your grandmother still has 2 daughters. I said nonchalantly, "It's fine, I'm my father's son, and I've inherited some of his traits. I'll take a knife and go to their home to threaten them. Whoever doesn't sign the apology letter, I'll kill them. If my mother dies, no one else will want to live." I threatened so calmly. The police officers didn't react for a while. However, just then, someone came in and said, "Team Leader Yang, Li Shanglan has committed suicide." 11. Li Shanglan was my mother's name. They said she couldn't stand the police questioning anymore and bit her tongue until she died. Unfortunately, she didn't succeed. Her tongue was bitten, and she was full of blood. But she didn't die. Not only did she not die, but speaking was not too affected. After she was discharged from the hospital, she still needed to be interrogated. I asked in bewilderment, "What is the doubt in the case? Do you have to wait until she dies before you stop questioning her?" The police were at a loss. They were also afraid that if my mother succeeded in committing suicide, they would also be responsible. By then, the case would remain unsolved and there would be an extra death on their hands. That would be even more difficult for them to handle. Very soon, I left the police station. A few days later, I was also notified to collect the bodies of my father and grandmother. Of course, they were no longer complete bodies. My grandmother's head had been chopped off, leaving only a layer of skin. My father's body was basically rotten from the neck to the abdomen. But I wasn't scared at all. As long as I could send their bodies to the crematorium, burn them to ashes, and scatter them down the drain, everything would be over. Yang, who had followed me, said with regret, "I sympathize with what happened to your mother and you, but murder is murder. Considering the actual situation of your family, our bureau will bear the cremation costs of your father and your grandmother. However, it will be a long time before the case goes to court. You can go to university and keep your phone open. You may need to testify in court at that time." I nodded and said, "I understand." He asked again, "Have you gathered enough money for college tuition? You should be able to apply for a student loan under your circumstances. After your mother is sentenced, you should inherit the family home, but since it was the scene of a murder, it will be difficult to sell or rent it. So our bureau has organized a fundraiser and raised some money to give you for living expenses." As soon as he finished speaking, I refused, saying, "I will find my own way to support myself. The thing I want to do most right now is cancel my household registration." I said firmly, "I want a household registration book with just my mother and me." Team Leader Yang nodded and said, "I'll write you a note on how to do this. Just follow the procedures." I thanked him and said, "Thank you." However, at that moment, a policewoman came over and said excitedly, "Team Leader Yang, there's been a turn of events. We found that there was something wrong with the Chun family's electrical wiring. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was premeditated." 12. The policewoman fixed her gaze on me. She took out a supermarket receipt and handed it to Captain Yang, saying, "This is a bottle of wine that Chun Zhang bought at his home 3 days before the incident. It cost 600 yuan, far more than the normal level of consumption in his family, but it was not found at the crime scene. The results of the tests have just come back, and it has been confirmed that Madame Chen had signs of electrocution before she died. Subsequent to this, the body was concealed by the knife wounds, and the neck was badly cut. We jumped to the conclusion that the cause of death was external trauma, and neglected the wounds that were invisible to the naked eye." Team Leader Yang and the other policemen were shocked, and countless gazes fell upon me. The policewoman continued, "Because of this bottle of wine, we discovered a problem with the electrical circuit at the crime scene, and then we thought to check the body for signs of electrocution. She speculated, I suspect that someone used this bottle of wine as bait, hoping that the victim would die of electrocution. The murderer should have wanted to use water to conduct electricity. But there was blood everywhere at the crime scene, and the water was covered up. And when Li Shanglan chopped the person, the water from the tap was probably on to deal with the bottle of wine. Whether it was to damage the electrical circuit or to use the wine as bait and use water to conduct electricity, this was not something that Li Shanglan, a rural woman, could have thought of." The policewoman's sharp gaze eventually fell on me. The only person who could have done all this was Chen Zhang, and Li Shanglan was taking the blame. For her son. What happened to the bottle of wine? Captain Yang didn't want to believe it, but he had to. He thrust the receipt in my face, and I asked coldly, "A receipt is proof that I bought the wine?" I paid in cash. I checked out the supermarket too, and there were no surveillance cameras. There were no surveillance cameras in the supermarket, but there was a bank opposite the supermarket, and the surveillance camera outside the bank captured his face. Without waiting for me to ask, the policewoman directly answered my doubts. Also, on the day of the incident, the student that Chen Zhang was tutoring went on a family outing, and Chen Zhang missed him. If Chen Zhang only found out about this after he arrived at the student's house, then he really did not have the time to commit the crime. But what if he knew in advance that the student was going to go out on an outing that day? Or even, did he plan the whole family outing that day? The goal was to create an alibi for himself. It was just an 8-year-old elementary school student, not to mention the case had nothing to do with them. The police would not deliberately suspect the child of lying, and the parents would not let their child get into something like this. Moreover, even if we had investigated this far, the words of a child could not be used as evidence. The policewoman said, he thought of everything so thoroughly, so it was impossible for it to be a crime of passion. It was a premeditated, planned murder. How thorough was he? He was discovered, wasn't he? The bank was separated from the supermarket by such a wide road, but they were still able to capture his face? Even if everything at the moment was the female police officer's speculation and could not be used as evidence, Yang still said to me, you cannot take the body away for the time being. You must come back to the police station with us for investigation. 13. I turned my neck, releasing the emotions that had been suppressed for a long time. You've been investigating for so long to prove that I killed someone, not my mother? I asked in puzzlement, why is that? Can't someone just confess? Why do you have to keep investigating? I asked curiously, do you police officers have so much free time? Chen Zhang. Yang Shou shouted, do you even know what kind of case this is? This is a major criminal case, 2 lives, hacked to death with a machete, the circumstances are heinous and the impact is great. Domestic violence is not a serious crime? It's not a matter of life and death? It doesn't have a big impact? Finally, I snapped. Not only that, but before they could react, I snatched the gun from the policewoman. I wanted to take her hostage, but the policewoman was, after all, professionally trained. I didn't stand a chance. I could only hold the gun against my head as I angrily asked, why do you have to investigate this? Why weren't you so conscientious when my mother was being abused? Why weren't you so intent on finding the truth when my mother was falsely accused of cheating? Why didn't anyone seek justice for my mother when she was repeatedly beaten to death? Is it because she wasn't beaten to death? Team leader Yang panicked and quickly tried to calm me down, saying, Chen Zhang, calm down. I've always been calm, but you insisted that I wasn't. I yelled, I don't want to pretend anymore. I admit it. I shouted, there's no mistake, I killed that person. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was premeditated murder. It was a flawless premeditated murder. If that old woman hadn't gone out of her way to get him a drink, it would have been the perfect case of accidental electrocution. I couldn't stop crying when I said this, but how could a mother love her son so much? It was just a bottle of wine, and she was over 50 years old, but she still worried that her strong and healthy son would get into trouble? The voltage was enough to kill him, but the old woman had injured her hand and was wearing gloves. She only felt the electric shock, not the death one, and then her son knew what had happened. Should I not kill him, and wait for him to kill me? Aren't you curious as to why I cut his stomach open? Because I kicked him there twice. My mother had to destroy the evidence in order to take the blame for me. I really don't understand. I asked them over and over again, why are you investigating so thoroughly? My mother was about to commit suicide so that I could be exonerated. But I didn't want to be without a mother. We had nothing else to look forward to. She went to prison and I went to school. We just hoped that we could see each other through the glass window during the holidays. Why wouldn't they grant us such a small wish? Their lives are lives, but aren't our lives lives too? Chen Dalon's life was so precious, but was Li Shanglan's life so worthless? Men who commit domestic violence are citizens you protect, but women who are victims of domestic violence are not. I asked them, why is divorce so difficult? If the relationship has broken down, why can't they get a divorce? If they are being battered, can they get a divorce? They have already gone to the Civil Affairs Bureau, but he beats them in full view of the public. Where were the police at that time? They went to the hospital with bruises and swelling to have their injuries verified, but the injury report didn't even say that the injuries were minor. They went to the police station, but you said that the Women's Federation should handle this matter. How would they handle it? They would just advise, fighting and making up as part of being a couple. Young couples make good old age companions, and think about the children. Think about the children? What did they want for their children in such a family? My mother and I had no other hope than to think, when I get into university, we'll leave that home together, go far away, and never come back. But he wouldn't let us. He tried to tamper with my ambitions and forbid me to go to such a faraway city. He said he would go wherever my mother went. My mother had no choice but to say she wouldn't go with me. But what did he say? He said if I dared not come back after graduating from university, he would treat my mother like a punching bag and beat her 3 times a day, and if she had a midnight snack, she would get an extra beating. No one would care as long as she didn't die from the beatings. I just had to kill him, and only when he was dead would my mother be free. But I was wrong. The chain around her mother's ankle was never my father's, it was mine. I was the lock that kept her from being free. So even if my father died, she still couldn't escape. She still had to take the blame for her son. 14. I was so excited, so high. I had finally said everything I wanted to say. I only hated myself. Why did it take me so long to think of killing him and getting it over with? If only I had killed him when I hit him with the stick the first time, the police would not have questioned me again and again. If only I had put rat poison in his rice when I was young, my mother would not have suffered so much. Just then, my mother's voice came from afar, shouting, "Son, don't. Xiaoxiang, don't. My son, don't." The police were probably trying to get her to persuade me to calm down, but she was even more uncalm than I was. "My son, you are my life, don't do this." "It's okay, the lawyer said there would be no death penalty, and your mother will go to prison with you, and there will always be a moment when we get out. I just want you to be alive, just be alive. No matter if you are a university student or a criminal, in your mother's heart, you will always be her good son." She cried and screamed to come over, but 2 policemen held her back. She cried out to the heavens, saying, "The sky hasn't fallen, and I'm still alive." Team leader Yang also advised, "Chen Zhang, don't be impulsive. The law is merciless, but people are compassionate. The court will judge according to the circumstances. As long as people are alive, there is hope. The law will give everyone a chance to turn over a new leaf." Maybe so. But I haven't had one, so why should I change? I raised my hand to wipe away the tears and said to my mother, "Mom, don't be sad, don't be upset, even if you don't have me, you have to live on. I don't want to go to prison. I don't want you to watch your son go to prison and be unable to do anything about it. I don't want you to worry and bear the burden for me. I want you to fly, to go anywhere you want. I want you to be free, to live for yourself, without being threatened by anyone, without compromising on anything. I am your son, but I am also his son. But if he doesn't deserve a son, then he deserves to die a violent death and be childless." I shouted, "You are Li Shanglan, a living person. You are not anyone's daughter, wife or mother. You are yourself. Live on. I will be by your side in another form. I will become the wind, the rain, a seedling, a flower, a puppy, a cat, and always be by your side." With a bang, everything came to an end. The moment I fell to the ground, my soul was finally released. I felt as if I saw my mother smiling. She was smiling so sweetly and happily, and said to me, "My baby, welcome to this world. I am your mother. I am the one who is closest to you. I will do everything in my power to protect you." With a whoosh, I let out a cry. If someone could hear my cry, I would say, "No. Woman, you must be yourself before you can be a mother to a child." Extra. I am Li Shanglan. Today's wind is gentle. Today's rain is beautiful. The seedlings and flowers are growing well. The kittens and puppies are well behaved. I am free. Therefore, my child is also free. I am happy. Therefore, my child is also happy. I am smiling. He is also smiling.